Dan, I am honored to have you here on the podcast today. Thank you so much for coming to share your insights with this audience.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Robert, and very nice of you to invite me. I'm excited to be with you.
Well, I'm excited to have you here, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell the audience why briefly. Dan is one of those people whose advice you need to listen to. And just to put it right in your lane, if you're a financial advisor listening to this or a firm that supports financial advisors, Dan's processes, particularly what he calls the Solin process, just one example of his work, has generated over 1.5 billion in AUM for firms he has supported. So that's not a small number. What Dan teaches actually works. And I'll also say about Dan, he's the type of guest sometimes we struggle to reach. He's been on things like the O'Reilly Factor, MSNBC, The Early Show, CNN Money. So he's a bit of a, you could say, guru. I know a lot of people don't like to be called that, but the things we're going to be talking about today, I would say Dan is a true guru. So Dan, let's dive right in. I want to talk about some of your work, particularly I'm interested in the work you've done to teach people about how to relate to other people, how to make deep and meaningful connections. Because as you know, in the financial services industry, trusting all of your wealth and your financial plan and your future to an advisor is a very deep and personal thing. So why don't you get us started by telling us about some of the processes, some of the work you've done to help advisors do that more effectively?
Okay, so thanks for that question, Robert. I'm a evidence-based, research-oriented person. All of my books I support with extensive bibliographies. I don't think people should pay much attention to my opinions or my judgment or even my experience. I think either, as with investing, either it is found somewhere in academia and well supported, or it really doesn't have much merit. So I was a financial advisor. But unlike many financial advisors, I had the good fortune of having written 2 New York Times best-selling investing books. But what I found was my conversion rate was no better than the conversion rate of my peers, maybe even slightly worse. And I was handling really warm leads of people who had read my book and would say things like, "Oh, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. I love your book." So I took a lot of time off, did some research, and tried to figure out, is there a research-based way to convert prospects into clients? And I spent about a year writing a book called Ask How to Relate to Anyone, in which I put all my findings. And just to give you, to give me a little bit of credibility, in the 5 years before I wrote that book, I had generated $55 million of assets under management. In the 1 year, when I implemented what I wrote about in the book, which is what you referred to as what's now known as the Solin Process, I generated $100 million of assets under management. It was like magic, but it had meaningful collateral benefits as well in my personal life. And in fact, it's kind of anomalous that usually when I'm on podcasts like yours, people are very interested in knowing, how do I convert more prospects into clients? But actually, it's a much bigger picture here, which is, how do I have better relationships with everybody in my life, particularly people I love and care about? And this process is of equal value to both, because the brain doesn't really understand. The brain doesn't say, "Oh, I'm going to react a certain way because he's trying to convert me into a client," as opposed to, "Oh, I'm going to react a certain way because he's talking to me as a friend or as a confidant or as a spouse or partner." So bottom line is, I did a lot of research, came up with the Solon process, which in essence is ask questions. Put aside your agenda. It's a little more detailed than that, but the essence of it is, it's not about you. It's about a list. It's not about you conveying information, which is the orientation of financial advisors. It's about you eliciting information, getting the other person to talk. You will, in that way, get them engaged. When people are engaged, they like you. When people like you, they trust you. When they like you and trust you, they hire you. And that's the way conversion rates go way up. when you learn more about the Solin process and employ it.
Yeah. And you know, you simplified it a lot by saying it essentially boils down to ask questions, but I know it's more nuanced than that. And I know there's science behind it as well. And that's one of the things that I think is important to understand. It's not just any question, any type of question, but you know, advisors can be good at filling out a form that gets the basic information, but that's not going to have the same impact. But you talk about really getting people to talk about themselves and the way that you can get them to open up so that you build that trust. You know, what is the science behind that?
So there are many studies, but I'll give you the seminal study, which was done in the psychology department of Harvard. They did a series of studies, and I'm going to distill them to their essence. Okay. They hooked up participants to what's called a functional MRI, which is a fancy expression for measuring brain activity in real time. So right now, Robert, if I had you hooked up to a functional MRI, I could see what part of your brain is engaged, what part isn't engaged, what part is bored and distracted. So they asked them to engage in a series of experiments while they were hooked up to a functional MRI. And what they found was in one of the experiments, when they simply said to them, in your case, I'll say it to you, Robert, just tell me about yourself. They found that the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that reacts to highly pleasurable activities, lit up in a way that was indistinguishable from the most pleasurable activities that humans can engage in. And they were stunned by this because it was like addictive gambling, sex, whatever, fine dinners, wine, indistinguishable, just talking about yourself. So they did a subsequent experiment and they said, we want you to talk about yourself, and what you're saying is so important, we're going to transcribe it and show it to others. When that happened, the prefrontal cortex lit up even more. So the study is a little complicated, but the bottom line of the study is quite simple. I read that study and I said, I wonder what would happen if when I went to convert prospects into clients, I wonder what would happen if all I did was say, so Robert, really nice to meet you. Tell me a little bit about yourself. No agenda. And the point you made was quite profound when you laid the foundation for this question. You said, it's not any question. There are a lot of sales techniques that, in my opinion, incorrectly teach advisors kind of a funnel method. Start here. You're trying to you're trying to steer the conversation in a particular direction and get it to where you want it to go. I couldn't find any support for that. So the Solin process is don't do that. Just let the conversation go wherever it's going to go. If I say, Robert, tell me about yourself, and you want to tell me how you started Snappy Kraken, or what your favorite hobby is, or what your favorite vacation is, I'm just going to keep asking soft, natural, authentic, non-manipulative follow-up questions. And we're just going to go wherever the conversation takes us.
Yeah. And that's human at its very core. That's how we connect with people and engage with them. It doesn't come from having an agenda. And you've mentioned the word agenda a few times and setting aside the agenda because the goal cannot be an agenda if you want meaningful relationships. The goal has to be different. And so when you are in a conversation like that, I think some advisors may have a fear that if they don't shape the direction enough, they'll end up losing too much time, not getting their points across, not sinking the hook, as it were. And so, how do you overcome that to let yourself have a conversation that is at its core this natural?
So speaking of hooks, is a good segue into a story I want to tell you. And the issue you're raising is the most common objection to the Solin process. You phrased it very nicely. Typically, it's phrased to me as follows. When do I get a chance to give my pitch? When do I get a chance to tell how great I am, what my background is, why I'm the right advisor? And when I give them the answer, they're very deflated, which is you only answer questions when you're asked a question. If you're asked a question that said, if I said, Robert, tell me about your background, where'd you go to school? Answer that question and then do what's called the Solin pivot. Did I answer your question or would you like more details? If they want more details, get them an answer. If they don't answer. So the hook was this. I had a coaching consultation with a very fine advisor based in Oregon, where fly fishing is a very big deal, apparently. And we prepared right before a huge client was coming to meet with him. And it was a $10 million client. And I said, okay, call me after because it's our first session together. I want to understand how it went. Called me afterwards. I said, how'd it go? He said, terrible. I said, tell me why. He said, all he wanted to talk about was fly fishing. Now, we are avid fly fishermen ourselves. So you told me not to talk about myself, not to steer the conversation. I did exactly what you said. And at the end of an hour, we hadn't talked anything about me, my firm, our investment philosophy. And part of the Solin process, the only rigid part is at the end of the hour, you're supposed to say, how would you like to proceed? So I did say what you told me. I said, how would you like to proceed? He said, let me think about it and get back to you. I said, why do you think that went terrible? He said, because he knows nothing about what we do. I said, you have a 99% chance of getting that client. And he said, why do you believe that? I said, because picture he was going to interview 5 other firms. All of those firms would be somebody at the whiteboard, lecturing, educating, talking. You were the only one that showed interest in him as a person. If he has questions, he's not stupid. He's going to come back and ask you questions. So instead of you assuming you know what those questions should be and you're going to provide those answers, you're going to wait. And if he has those questions, then you'll answer them. And he did get that client. That's a typical story.
Yep, I love that story, and it does speak to the power of showing personal interest. And actually, Dan, this is not quite as strategic; it's more tactical. But I am curious, from your perspective, some advisors lead with information gathering. Before I can help you, I need to see all your tax returns and your investment statements, and bring your A, B, and C and your estate plan in. How does that work with the Solin method? Is it something, or Solin process rather, is it something that you believe should wait? Or is it something that should be done upfront?
So the short answer is it works very badly with the Solin process. And here's why. When you think about it, and I often get this feeling that advisors who tend to be thoughtful, sensitive, kind, caring, intelligent people, but something gets into their brain when they go into financial advisor mode and they become kind of tone deaf. So to say to somebody you don't know and have just met, before I can help you, I need to know intimate details about your financial life that you probably haven't shared with anybody. And that's the way I want to start our relationship off. Makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. What makes sense to me is establishing whether there's a fit first, whether we like each other, whether I want to work with you. If I do, I'm not going to have the slightest problem understanding that before you can do an investment policy statement, you obviously need to know something about my assets. But you have a website. On your website, it talks about who you are and what you do, and it probably gives your fees. It probably talks about minimums. So most people go to websites, so there is no need for any significant screening, and it just is putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, I agree with that, and thank you for sharing that perspective. Now, when it comes to forging long-term, meaningful relationships with clients, I can understand why this works. It's the beginning of the relationship. You're getting close to the person, you're building trust. Now you win them over as a client. How do you incorporate this into your ongoing relationships, to make sure that those relationships get stronger, that they're strengthened over time. It's not just a sales process thing, it's an ongoing thing. So, can you talk about that?
Yeah, another good question, Robert. The process of always showing an interest in other people at whatever stage of your relationship, that process doesn't change. And often what happens is in the second meeting after you've been hired, so it's now called the discovery meeting, right? And advisors can't wait for the discovery meeting. Great, I finally get to talk. I get to ask all these questions. I get to gather all this information. But humans are dynamic, they're not static. So between the first meeting and the second meeting, a lot could have gone on. There could have been a death in the family. Maybe there's a divorce, some other event. So all interactions start with, what would you like to talk about today? How
Mhm.
can I make this meeting really productive for you? And assuming they say nothing, I'm fine with anything, then you say, great. Well, typically what I do is I gather some information so we can prepare an investment policy statement. Is that something you're comfortable with? It's always that asking that question, making clear that control of the meeting is transferred from you to now the client.
It's very empowering. And that's one of the things sometimes people leave their advisors for, especially women after their husbands die. They don't feel really empowered in the relationship. They don't feel like they are at the center of it. And this really, it's a better way to deliver advice. It makes people more open to it anyway. And so this is really profound, Dan. And I know it's different from how many advisors operate, but I want to also go into another area where you've applied this and very effectively, and that's related to branding and marketing. Because when it comes to this likability that you gain, that trust that you build when you're sitting across from somebody, some might conclude that doesn't equate to your branding and marketing, but it actually does. And you've taught a lot about how when you are branding yourself, it's more important to brand yourself as someone who is likable than someone who is an expert. And I know that runs counter to what a lot of advisors think and what a lot of marketing agencies do, where their positioning is, how do we make this person just seem super smart and super credentialed and super educated? And advisors work hard for their credentials, so they want to lead with all their letters. But there's a better way to attract clients. Can you talk to us about how this applies in branding and marketing?
So I don't want to overstate this. I mean, we have a very large practice writing content for advisors, and the content we write is substantive content on various different subjects that is intended to establish the expertise of investment advisors. I do encourage advisors, though, not to get caught up with how many angels fit on the head of a pin. I mean, you can really get, very few people are as interested in the nuances of investing as most advisors are. So when we do content marketing, we often suggest subjects like, what's the best way to communicate with your investment advisor? 10 questions you should ask your investment advisor. When we do branding and marketing, what we're always thinking about is this about us or is this about the client? Because if it's about us, we're in the wrong direction here. It has to be about the client. When we write anything, the worst comment we can get, and we rarely get it anymore, but we used to, is, this sounds preachy, right? Nobody wants to be educated. Nobody wants to be lectured to. People want to feel that you have an authentic interest in me as a person. So one of the lines that I have, when I do feedback with talks, I say, if I said anything that stayed with you, tell me what it was. And one of the phrases that I use is, instead of being the most interesting person in the room, your job is to be the most interested. That stays with people. Or, I'd like you to be the most curious person. So marketing is about curiosity. It's about being interested. I can't appeal to you unless I know what you're interested in. And I don't know what you're interested in if I know nothing about you. I'm going to go out on a limb with you, though, Robert, because I have to say that this process that I'm talking about is much easier for introverts like me than it is for extroverts. I'm under no illusions. People are not fascinated when I walk into a room. All conversation does not stop. All eyes do not turn and stare at me. I am not particularly charismatic. I don't draw people to me. I'm under none of these illusions. So I'm outwardly directed to begin with because I'm an introvert. I much prefer to listen than to talk. I can tell when I meet somebody, and this is where I'm going out on a limb. To me, you are an introvert. You present as an introvert. When I meet somebody, the first thing I'm thinking is, I know who I am. I'm an introvert. Who's Robert? If I conclude that you're an introvert, and sometimes I'm wrong, but rarely, then I can pretty much anticipate that if I say to you, Robert, tell me about yourself, you are likely to say something like, Dan, what would you like to know? Which is what I would say if you ask me, as opposed to, let me give you Robert 101, starting with grade school and going up through my current position. So it's important to know when you're applying my process, if you say to an extroverted prospect, Mary, tell me about yourself, you can sit back for a long time. I mean, she has a lot to say. So you need to know yourself. You need to know who you're talking to.
Wow, that's very insightful. And you're right. If you get that wrong, it doesn't work out in the ideal fashion. Now, you've just touched on something that I think is a struggle for some advisors, actually, which is being more introverted in a community and industry where the extroverts are the dominant ones, and they arguably tend to be the ones that are on the pedestal most of the time, talking about their business and their success. And so sometimes introverts can feel disempowered in some ways to be successful as an advisor. That's not been true for you. You've been very successful as an advisor, and other introverts have as well. But you've actually written in the past about how being an introvert can actually be a strength in this business. I think you just alluded to it, but I want to make sure that point doesn't get missed. If there is an introverted advisor listening to this, what should they take away?
So the first thing I would tell every introvert is to read a book by Susan Cain, Cain, called Quiet. She's a Harvard psychology professor. When I read that book, it was just eye-opening to me because I'm on the spectrum like most introverts. We're not extreme introverts like I can barely talk, but I'm nevertheless very clearly on the introverted part. And she explains how to determine if you're an introvert or an extrovert, how introverts think, how we respond. And what reading that book did for me is, oh, I'm not weird. I'm actually just kind of like a typical introvert. Many people don't like things that extroverts find is fun. Like if I met you, where are you located, by the way?
I'm in North Georgia, up in the mountains.
Okay, so if I went to North Georgia and you said, Dan, great idea, let's go to a bar and we'll drink all night, that's like my greatest nightmare, right? I'm an introvert. I don't do bars. I don't do drinking all night. But if you said, let's go out for a quiet dinner, just the two of us, now I'm in my comfort zone. So knowing that, really very important. I could give you a list of wildly successful introverts ranging from Albert Einstein to Bill Gates. Um, I personally love being an introvert. Once I figured out that what I'm uncomfortable with is small talk, large groups, a lot of noise, a lot of activity. Once I figured that out, it was okay. So I go to North Georgia, I meet you and a couple of your friends, hopefully not 50 of them, but if it's a small group, now I know that all I have to do is ask questions. All I have to do is elicit information about them. And once introverts figure out that that's the key to success as advisors, the most successful advisors I know are introverts.
I love it. Actually, if you're an extrovert listening to this, you're actually getting a lesson that's a really important one, because extroverts can tend to talk about themselves too much. And so that quality of being a person who listens more and is more comfortable listening will serve you well. And even if it's not your nature, just getting in the practice of doing that is valuable. And it actually makes me think about the adage. I don't know who has said it. There's been research on it, and I bet you can tell me the research, but where the people in meetings who talk the most are perceived to be the most authoritative, most intelligent, have the right answers. Although, in fact, that may not be true. The quieter ones in the meetings are perceived to be less intelligent, weaker, not have the answers. And that is often not true. So, when you are in a room with your clients and they're doing most of the talking, well, doesn't that mean you're making them the smartest person in the room? And who doesn't feel good about that?
Very well. I couldn't say that any better. Very true. And it's also true about the research. We tend to perceive people who are talking, who are dominating the room, as being very confident. They really understand what they're doing. But when there's this incredible chemical reaction, it's serotonin, it's oxytocin largely, that floods into the prefrontal cortex of the brain. When you let people talk and you let them be that person, now you really have magic. I used to say, when I pre-COVID, I would give a lot of talks, and there'd be, say, 100 or 150 people in the room. I'd say, raise your hand if this has ever happened to you. You're in some kind of an environment, social, business, or otherwise. You're talking to somebody and you relay a story that you think is really interesting, like you took a special trip somewhere, or you ran a marathon, or you did something really interesting. And the other person stopped, looked at you and said, tell me more about that. I've talked to thousands of advisors in Europe, Australia, North America. Maybe 5 hands have gone up. And when I probe, it's always like this. Tell me more about that experience that you had. Who did that? They'll say, oh, my best friend, my mother, my aunt. And I'll say, how do you feel about that person? They'll say, oh, I love that person. And then I look at the audience and I say, what if instead of that one hand going up in this audience, all hands went up and they pointed to you and said, you are the person who made them feel like that. How do you think they would all feel about you? It's really very meaningful. The work I do is very validating, because you can see the light bulb go on. And what I say to people, and I'll say this to people in your audience, if you're skeptical, as many people are, when you hear this, like, oh, it can't be that easy, try it at home. When you're at home with a loved one, just start asking nice, soft questions with very, not cross-examined questions, but like, so what'd you do today? Did you enjoy that? Was it fun? Try it with children. Who'd you play with at school today? Is he a good friend, or is she a good friend? Just watch what happens. Look at people's eyes while you're doing it. You can see the transformation. It's really dramatic.
Yeah. Yeah, it's powerful. And as I've listened to you just relate different scenarios and questions, I've noticed commonalities in these questions, like, tell me about yourself, or how did you like that? Tell me more about that. Even somebody asks you to tell about yourself and you say, well, what would you like to know? These are all a certain type of question in my mind. I hear them as questions that have no wrong answers. I hear them as questions that are completely open for the person to go wherever they want. They're not designed to elicit a certain type of response. They're not strategic. They're just very open questions to get to know where somebody's thinking is at.
Exactly.
And I'd love you to just give us a few more like that. What are some other really powerful questions that advisors can use in conversation to be more effective at this?
So one of the things I want people to come away with is this, because it's a question that always comes up. What if I say, tell me more about that, or start asking questions, and I'm getting monosyllabic answers, and I just can't engage in a dialogue? So I want to be really clear. The Solin process is not about imposing anything on anyone. If the feeling, and I'll tell you a story that illustrates it. When I was first trying this out, I had an engineer who was a prospect, and I said just what I said to you. Tell me a little bit about yourself. I'd like to know something about you. And he looked at me and said, look, Dan, I'm not into small talk. I didn't come here to engage in small talk. I've got 10 questions. I'd be really grateful if you would just answer them. I said, perfect. Let's start with your first question. We went down his list of 10 questions. And then I said to him, how would you like to proceed? And he said, how do we get started? It's a great meeting, right? So I don't want people to think that you're forcing people to engage in chit chat when they don't want to. Your job is to find out what they want to talk about, what agenda they have. In the normal course, what will happen is after there's some conversation that's general, most people have something on their minds. So they will say to you, so I'm worried about risk, or I'm worried about, tell me how you invest. Tell me what happens if you're hit by a bus. I mean, they'll have something on their minds. And so the conversation will normally go that way. But I do want to be clear that I'm not recommending you impose anything.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to make. And that would be counter to the advice you're giving, which is taking an interest in the person. If the person has an aversion to conversing that way or opening up at all, then you're not really interested in them by pushing that. You're actually just trying to follow your own process that you like. So
You're imposing something that
yeah.
they don't want to have imposed on them, which is the opposite of my process. Tell you one more quick story. This is what caused somebody to come to me in the first place. Couple comes in, the advisor goes through the normal thing, talks for 50 minutes, then says, we've got a couple of minutes left. So do you have any questions? The wife looks at the husband nervously and says, do you think he has time to talk about special needs trusts? Because that's what we're here for. This is how common it is for advisors to completely misread a room, to make all kinds of assumptions based on appearance, comments, looks, whatever, that just are often not valid. And that's when you employ my process, that never happens.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's amazing how you learn these lessons the hard way sometimes, but they don't always sink in. I remember when I was in early sales job back in probably 2000, right out of school, and I misread a prospect, and they ended up, I thought they were wasting my time, and I probably didn't treat them as well as I should have because I felt that way. They ended up being the biggest customer I had all year and leading me to win the national sales competition that month. And
Wow.
so, and I'll tell you, I learned that lesson and I never forgot. Don't judge people based on appearances. Ask the right questions. It's always stuck with me. And that's one of the reasons I love your work. And I think it's meaningful and more than just being effective. I think it's the right way to treat people. And if we're in a business as important as this, uh, financial future, financial health, I can't imagine a doctor diagnosing me and prescribing something without asking me questions about my symptoms. This is, to me, this is 101, but not enough advisors do it. And that's why the ones that you train to do this have outstanding success. It's a true differentiator, isn't it?
It really is. And the good thing, I'll tell you, I always say this, I have a very bad business model and a very good process. It's a bad business model because good business models are complicated, because that means we're going to have many sessions and it's going to cost a lot of money. Really, people could record this podcast, play it over and over again, and if they didn't know any more, they'd be just fine. Right? It's a very easy process to implement. And it's not like psychotherapy, right? Where you have to go for several years before you start to see progress. from the very first time you show a genuine interest in other people in a non-manipulative way, you will see an immediate positive reaction, and that becomes self-enforcing. And so now what we're doing is creating a new habit. My brain is now trained. When I meet you for the first time, I'm thinking, I want to know more about him. I want to learn more about him. And if you really think about it, like right now I'm talking, right? I couldn't be saying the words I'm saying if I didn't know these words, obviously, right? It's kind of boring listening to myself. It's interesting learning about you. I know nothing about you. I know nothing about what you do. I don't know that much about Snappy Kraken. I would much rather talk about the person in front of me than talk about myself. I'll learn something.
Yeah. Yeah. But you're a podcast guest, Dan, and we wanted you to talk about yourself. So thank you for doing that. I am gonna use one of your questions because uh, actually this has been a great use of 30 minutes or so, but I want the audience to come away with your best strategies. And so I'm going to try the Solin method myself here at the end of this podcast. I'm going to say, Dan, is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I think you did a great job of asking the right questions. And I think I'd leave it at this. I think of human interactions as I call it the battle of the agendas. I have an agenda, you have an agenda. So I have a choice to make. If I want to get to where I want to go, which is to be perceived as likable and trustworthy and ultimately to win your business, I have to give up my agenda. So that's a battle you want. You want to lose the battle of the agendas.
I can't think of a better takeaway than that. Thank you so much, Dan, for all your insights today. And if our listeners want to find you, find your books, where should they go? Where should we direct them?
So my website for my business is danielsolin.com, and my new book is Wealthier, the Investing Field Guide for Millennials. And the website for the book is wealthierbook.com. It is available on Amazon May 15.
Dan, thank you again very much for joining me today, for sharing all of this great insight, good learnings, things that I want to go put into practice for myself right away. And I know our listeners do too. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate being on your podcast. Thank you.